Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a slave? Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a slave in North Carolina?
The degradation, the wrongs, the vices that grow out of slavery are more than I can describe. They're greater than you would willingly believe. Everywhere the years bring to all enough of sin and sorrow. But in slavery, the very dawn of life is darkened by these shadows.
Harriet Jacobs was born a slave in Edenton, North Carolina. Though she was born in bondage, she describes her childhood as happy until both her mother and mistress died, and she was sold to a family member of her mistress. After that, her experience with slavery was very different. She was eventually able to escape and went on to write a book. It's through slave narratives such as hers that we're able to get first-hand accounts of what life was like for those Americans who were enslaved. Another resource are the volumes of interviews of former slaves housed at the Library of Congress. Both of these sources give us a fuller picture of slave life in my own home state of North Carolina. Around 1800, there were about 140,000 black people living in North Carolina, which was a little less than a third of the population. A few of these were free blacks who mostly farmed or worked in skilled trades, but the majority were slaves. Most slaves in North Carolina did not live on a large plantation, but rather on small to medium-sized farms. 53% of slave owners in the state owned 5 slaves or less, and only 2.6% of slaves lived on farms with over 50 other slaves during this time period. By 1850, only 91 slave owners in the entire state owned over 100 slaves. Though the plantations may not have been as large as those in the deeper South, that did not mean the work was any easier for them. On average, field slaves in North Carolina, just as elsewhere in the country, worked sunrise to sunset, 5.5 to 6 days a week, usually, though not always, allowed Sunday off.
No, I never know what it was like to rest. I just work all the time from morning till late at night. I had to do everything they want to do on the outside. Work in the field, chop wood, hoe corn, till sometime I feel like my back shoulder break.
This was the average, but some of the skilled workers were allowed more flexibility. Harriet Jacobs writes about her father, who was a carpenter.
On condition of paying his mistress $200 and supporting himself, he was allowed to work at his trade and manage his own affairs.
It was during their very short amount of free time that many slaves would do personal work. Slaveholders were required to provide provisions of food and clothing, but in general the prevailing attitude was to provide only the bare minimum. Therefore, some worked at night in order to clothe their families. Some also tended a small plot of land or fished as well. Those that were not able to do this went without adequate food and wore the same clothes day after day until they were no more than rags which fell off their bodies.
The Abernathy's weren't good to us. We got very little to eat, nothing to wear, and a whole lot of whoopings. Ain't got no slaves except some I ate. In fact, they're poor white trash trying to get rich, so they makes us work. They works us from daylight to dark, and sometimes we just gets one meal a day. They master said, empty niggas are good niggas, and the full niggas, they got the devil in them.
though Jacob's experiences were less severe in this regard due to the care and protection of her grandmother.
Little attention was paid to the slaves' meals in Dr. Flint's house. If they could catch a bit of food while it was going, well and good. I gave myself no trouble on that score, for on my various errands, I passed my grandmother's house, where there was always something to spare for me. I was frequently threatened with punishment if I stopped there, and my grandmother, to avoid detaining me, often stood at the gate with something for my breakfast or dinner. I was indebted to her for comfort, spiritual or temporal. It was her labor that supplied my scanty wardrobe. I have a vivid recollection of the Lindsley woolly dress given me every winter by Miss Flint. How I hated it. It was one of the badges of slavery.
One way in which some autonomy was allowed was in courtship and marriage. This was not out of the goodness of the slaveholders' hearts, more so the fullness of their pockets. Children born of these unions would add to the wealth of the slave owners. Therefore, it was in their best interest to allow or even encourage slave marriages. Usually, the slaves would ask permission from their owners to marry. However, even if granted, it did not provide them any protection should the owner decide to separate them later. Slave marriages were not recognized by any law, so owners could break family